Members of the jury, this is Dr. Chris Condon. For the past 2+ decades of his award-winning medical career, Dr. Condon has been meeting with patients, listening to their symptoms, and finding an appropriate plan for treatment. He's made countless diagnoses, got a wealth of experience, and he's learned one simple rule of medicine. You cannot treat what is not there. Dr. Condon first met Mr. Bobby Daly as a patient in June of 2015. Mr. Daly had just been brutally attacked, and Dr. Condon was helping him recover. Dr. Condon listened very carefully to the symptoms that Mr. Daly described. You've heard of them today. The gaps in the memory, the bad headaches, the issues with focus and concentration, and mood swings. Dr. Condon considered several diagnoses, including post-concussion disorder, and yes, even a seizure disorder. It was at this point that Dr. Condon prescribed a drug that you've heard a lot about today called gabapentin. Prescribed it off-label to help treat with some of the pain and mood issues that Mr. Daly was having. Of course, Dr. Condon was responsible and warned Mr. Daly that certain side effects exist. And as a result, he warned Mr. Daly that he should avoid driving for the time being. And Mr. Kajui spent a lot of time going over the font changes in the medical records that you've seen today. Of course, they want you to believe that Dr. Condon was sneaky enough to go back and try and change his medical records. But he also wants you to believe that Dr. Condon is so sloppy as to Mr. Daly's symptoms just weren't consistent with a seizure disorder. They were consistent with post-concussion syndrome. Now, the car accident that took place on September 4th, 2016 happened when Mr. Daly's car struck the plaintiff's car. The plaintiff took the stand today and told you that he saw Mr. Daly slumped over the steering wheel. And this is important. It's important because the plaintiff is the only person today who can tell you what exactly was happening in the moments right before the accident. But I want you to review the evidence that you heard today when the plaintiff was on the stand. My co-counsel, Mr. DeCamp, asked the plaintiff questions about what exactly was going on. And this is what you heard. The accident took place a little after 7:30. It was dark. It was on a narrow residential road that was poorly lit. The plaintiff was hurrying back and forth in his car all day, but also had been drinking before getting behind the wheel of the car before the accident. The plaintiff had already been ticketed for his careless driving after drinking and getting behind the wheel. And the plaintiff told you that ever since the car accident, his memory's been a little foggy. And the plaintiff, most importantly, told you that he didn't get a good look into Mr. Daly's car. The plaintiff told you that he has no idea what Mr. Daly was doing before the accident. Those are the words that he said on the stand today. So, why is this important? It's important because no evidence that you heard from a single witness today can tell you what exactly was happening in the moments right before the accident. We've all heard the news stories where drivers get into accidents because they're doing things that they shouldn't be doing while driving. They haven't been paying attention. Mr. Daly could have been doing any of the things we are routinely warned against doing while driving. Mr. Daly could have been fiddling with the radio. Mr. Daly could have been answering a text message, could have been picking something up off the floor of his car. He could have been scrounging for loose change. He could have been asleep at the wheel. He could have been tying his shoes. Any of these things would have had Mr. Daly slumped over the wheel of his car. Or, more accurately, looking like he was slumped over the wheel of his car. Members of the jury, you've heard today that seizures are notoriously difficult to diagnose. The plaintiff's own expert, when asked on cross-examination, agreed with me that it's difficult, if not impossible, to rely on the description of events of a seizure from the person who actually suffered it. So why is this important? It's important because the plaintiff did not put a single piece of evidence in front of you today, no testimony, no documents, that ever concretely proves that Mr. Daly has ever once in his entire life had a seizure. Nothing you heard today has proven that. But the plaintiff wants you to believe that Mr. Daly had an obviously diagnosable seizure disorder and that Dr. Condon was obviously negligent in failing to diagnose it. But I want you to remember the facts you actually heard. Every doctor who took the stand today agreed that the following symptoms, gaps in memory, bad headaches, issues with focus and concentration, and mood swings, all of those symptoms are consistent with post-concussion disorder. And we've heard a lot about a drug called gabapentin. We've heard that it treats shingles pain, it treats epilepsy, but I want you to remember what Dr. Hertz told you. Gabapentin is not designed to treat seizures by itself. It's supposed to be added on if you're already taking an anticonvulsant. It doesn't work. It's not approved by the FDA to treat seizures by itself. That's not its job. But we've also heard a lot about what's called off-label uses. All the doctors here today have told you that it's common for medication to be prescribed for off-label purposes. In this case, the defendant told you the gabapentin was prescribed to help with pain and with mood issues. Not with gaps in memory, but with pain and mood issues. And you'll have all of the medical reports in front of you when you're back in the deliberation room, and you'll be able to see. By the fourth visit, those symptoms were getting better. Dr. Condon was successfully treating Bobby Daly. But Dr. Condon didn't diagnose Mr. Daly with a seizure disorder because you cannot treat what is not there. The plaintiff has the burden in today's case. The plaintiff and the plaintiff alone has to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that Dr. Condon was negligent. They have to prove that it was more likely than not, 50% and a feather, that Dr. Condon was negligent. They had to prove that Dr. Condon should have treated a condition that was not there, and they obviously failed to meet their burden. Because not a single witness sat in that chair today and told you that they knew for sure that Mr. Daly had a seizure while driving. Nobody told you that. And Mr. Caggiui put up the whole art gallery of medical records in front of you during his closing argument, but he forgot one. I'd like to show it. This is the fourth and final medical record that Dr. Condon made when treating with Mr. Daly. It's March 2016. And there's a reason that Mr. Caggiui didn't have this in front of you during his closing arguments. But I want you to take a close look at it when you were deliberating back in the jury room. Right here in assessment. Symptom no longer suggestive of potential seizure disorder. The evidence that you have today shows that Dr. Condon was able to rule out a seizure disorder based on 9 months of care. Members of the jury, we've heard a lot today about a mandatory reporting law that exists here in Steelton. It's true. It's the law that if a doctor knows that their patient either suffered from a seizure or definitely had a seizure disorder, that they must report them to the Department of Transportation. But I want to be very clear. The law does not state if a doctor thinks their patient has a seizure disorder, or if the doctor guesses that their patient has a seizure disorder, or if maybe a patient has ever had a seizure, they need to be reported. No. It's if the doctor knows. And the plaintiff did not prove today that Dr. Condon knew for certain that Mr. Daly had a seizure disorder, or ever had a seizure in his life. You're going to have in front of you when you're deliberating a verdict form. This is the first page of that form. And on this form, you'll be asked questions. The first question is, was Chris Condon, MD, negligent? So let's go over that. The plaintiff wants you to believe that Dr. Condon knew or should have known that Mr. Daly had a seizure disorder, right? But there's something I heard a while back, and I'd like to say it to you here. You're picturing an animal. It has 4 legs, it has a tail, it has a mane, it has hooves, and it really likes apples. Members of the jury, you have a horse. You don't have a zebra. But the plaintiff wants you to believe that it was completely unreasonable for Dr. Condon to look at these symptoms. The gaps in the memory, the headaches, the loss of focus and concentration and the mood swings, and they want you to see a zebra. And furthermore, they think it is completely unreasonable for Dr. Condon to have diagnosed a post-concussion disorder, despite the fact that every doctor who took the stand today told you that those symptoms were consistent with a concussion. But the plaintiff wants you to believe that it was completely unreasonable for Dr. Condon to come to that conclusion. But members of the jury, that's not what the facts show. The facts show the defendant was not negligent. The second question that you'll be asked is whether or not Dr. Condon's actions caused the accident. Cause and fact. The plaintiff wants you to believe that had Dr. Condon reported Mr. Daly to the Department of Transportation, that this wouldn't have happened. But they didn't give you any proof that that would be true. Not a single person took the stand today and told you that, well, if they had reported Mr. Daly, that the Department of Transportation absolutely would have rescinded his license. It's entirely possible that the report would have gotten lost in the bureaucracy and never filed. Or if the Department of Transportation would have reviewed it and decided against suspending the license. They didn't give you any evidence that that actually would happen. Of course, they also didn't give you any evidence that Mr. Daly would have stopped driving. Dr. Condon told Mr. Daly to stop driving and he didn't listen. That advice, coming face to face from his own doctor, had no effect. But the plaintiff wants you to believe that a letter in the mail from the Department of Transportation would have kept Mr. Daly off the road. They weren't able to prove that either. They didn't bring a single piece of evidence that suggests that Mr. Daly would have listened to what anybody told him about driving. And because of that, plaintiff couldn't prove causation either. Members of the jury, Dr. Condon did not diagnose Mr. Daly with a seizure disorder. And for good reason. Because Dr. Condon knows that in medicine, you cannot treat what is not there. And because Dr. Condon followed that foundational rule of medicine, we ask that you find him not liable.